Hello and welcome to the Media Podcast. I'm Matt Deegan. Today it's a bit of a special as we're heading into one of the most competitive radio markets in the world, Australia, to talk about the nation's biggest breakfast show, Kyle and Jackie O. There are lessons for broadcasters everywhere, from how producers manage big talent to the 10-year deal to lock them in. We also speak to James Corden's podcast producer about how the move into podcasts is going and how Britain's Christian O'Connell charmed Australians and bagged a $5 million a year deal. All that plus we look at how Australia is having its own local versus national radio moment and how obscenities at breakfast is what audiences want. Probably. That's all to come in this special edition of the Media Podcast. A few weeks ago, I posted a clip on Twitter about Australian radio presenters Kyle and Jackie O as they started simulcasting their breakfast show in Sydney to Melbourne. It generated quite the response. Half my followers loved it, half hated it. So I wanted to talk a little more about it and kind of the nature of broadcast talent today. So first of all, I wanted to speak to some Australian radio and sort of general talent experts. Craig Bruce is an Australian radio consultant. He was on the air for many years and was part of some of Australia's most successful shows, including doing breakfast in Melbourne. He then went on to work in programming, climbing the ladder to become head of Austereo's Today Network, then head of content for SCA, during which time he launched Kyle and Jackie O's first breakfast show. Alongside his consulting, he ran a popular industry podcast that he brought back recently to chronicle Kyle and Jack's Melbourne campaign. My other guest, Geoff Jein, started his career at Radio 2, working across Steve Wright and Chris Evans, amongst others, before producing Christian O'Connell on 5 Live and then jumping to TV to produce The Right Stuff. He then swapped continents to Australia, producing a breakfast show in Perth and working for Craig, before returning to the UK to spend time on Christian's Absolute Breakfast Show, exec producing Jamie Theakston and Emma Bunton on Heart. He's just finished exec producing lots of episodes of James Corden's new radio show for Sirius XM, and has a new production company called Biscuit Gym. Hello, gents.
Hello. Hey, Matt.
Morning.
Hey, Geoff. Good to see you, mate.
I know, been a while.
It has. Way too long.
So before we get on to talking about Kyle and Jackie O, let's take a listen.
The Kyle and Jackie O Show.
Morning. Hello, everyone.
How are you?
Good,
Happy
Jackie.
Monday.
Oh, hello, everyone. Oh, it's a big day for us today. So, Brooklyn, maybe you can tell everyone, the new listeners in Melbourne, the top sort of 5 things about you.
Oh,
One,
yeah?
you're a great newsreader.
Yep.
You're
Thank
a
you.
massive homo.
You're gay, yeah.
Yes.
You used to be a
I-
real gay whore, didn't you? Like
I did, yeah. I've sort of famously had a few STIs.
Tell everyone
What are
which
the
one.
STIs?
Which
Well,
ones?
the worst was the crabs.
Crabs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Never got. I feel
never
like
lived that down.
crabs is just. I don't know anyone ever that's had crabs.
Well, there's no one really has pubic hair anymore.
Oh,
so-
that's
Yeah,
why. Gotcha.
yeah.
Did you
Do
have
you have-
pubes
you-
back
You know,
then?
you
you
shave them
would've.
off, the crabs persist.
Did you have AIDS?
No,
that's-
avoided
yeah.
that.
Someone had AIDS and cured Charlie Sheen had AIDS. That's right.
HIV.
No, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
What else? I drive a Tesla. And you
Right,
think
come
I'm
on.
full woke
Yep.
because of
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, Brooklyn is a woke piece of shit, just by the way, everyone. Everything's about charging cars. I'm a fuel-guzzling, ex-F-boy, coke-sniffing asshole. That's what I am.
Yeah.
And what else?
And I'm STI free and always have been. Touch wood.
Well, that just makes you sound like you're no fun.
Yeah,
I've
Jackie.
kept this pussy pristine. Big deal. You're like a Greek chick
I think-
that keeps the vagina fresh for the husband, but 40 guys have gone through the arse.
Well, they haven't
Like,
done that
come
to
on.
me, I can assure you.
You've never done the anal?
Well, I am not saying I haven't,
Right.
but yeah.
It must be all the safe sex. Is that
Safe
right? Is that it,
sex.
Jackie?
Or just lucky.
Geoff, as someone who's been a UK radio producer, what do you think of that? Would that work here?
I cannot tell you, when I moved to Australia, recalibrating your producer internal alarms was quite the thing, and I don't think I've quite managed to get back there. Look, it's shocking to anybody in the UK to hear a lot of that content on the radio. I think I can put myself back in my Australian role and accept that actually that is great content to the audience that Kyle and Jack are looking to reach. I thought, I'm sure Craig will talk about this more, Craig interviewed Kyle a few weeks ago for his podcast, and there was a really telling bit in there where Kyle said, we know our audience brilliantly, and we know that in that first hour, it is tradies going to work and nurses coming home, and that's our audience, and that's who we're serving, and that's the content that they want. And actually, in all of this talk of local radio, that is a really local targeting of a specific audience. It's not geographical, but it's a niche, and they're serving it brilliantly, and killing it. And it's different, and it's different here, and it's different in Australia. If that's what you want, it's great.
Craig, when listening to your podcast, when there was a lot of talk before they started about how they would do it, would they recalibrate for a different market? They've been on in Sydney for quite a long time, but I think it perhaps took you guys by surprise as well, how strong they went in?
Well, yes. I hadn't heard the show for a number of years, and I had worked closely with them for a long period of time, and then, went off to do other things, and really only just came back in listening to the show in the last 10 weeks in prep for this podcast that I'm currently doing. And it was shocking. So if it's shocking for you guys, don't worry, it's shocking for me. Just in terms of how far they've stretched the boundaries. It's like that. It's that frog in the pot thing. It's the slow boil that's happened over a number of years. Certainly the Sydney audience has absolutely been habituated to a level of content that they are comfortable with, rightly or wrongly. And the question is, there's a couple of questions around what they're doing in Melbourne. One is, when you do hear them for the first time, it is confronting. Like there's just no holds barred. And that's not going to work for a lot of people. But there will also be an audience that will be really comfortable and fine with it, because it's not just the swearing and they don't necessarily do it for effect. It's essentially the conversations that are happening off the air are now happening on the air. I've kept an eye on what Kyle and Jackie have been doing over the last couple of years, and they talked recently in an article where they said that, Kyle described the show as the naughty table where mates get together and just talk shit with each other, essentially. But this has developed over a long period of time, and he's just kept pushing the edge and pushing the boundary. So it was shocking for me to hear it, because, to be honest, Matt and Geoff, I've got no idea how they haven't had a code violation. Honestly, we do have codes. The industry is self-regulated, though, and you need a listener complaint. And the Sydney audience isn't complaining. They never complained. They've never complained about Kyle and Jack. For whatever reason, the audience profile, and it's a typical Hot AC Top 40 profile where there are women with kids in the car on the way to school in the 8 o'clock hour. And it just, for whatever, I don't know how they do it, but they managed to get away. So that point around, I think for him, he's looked at it and thought, I'm going to put a stake in the ground here, and I'm going to lean into the expectation that we are trouble. And I think that first hour, which was almost an hour in of itself unique to the rest of the show. The kind of content they did between 6 and 7 in that hour, they haven't necessarily replicated. So I felt like he just, right from the first moment the mics went on in Melbourne, he's gone, no apologies, I'm just going for it. You're either going to like it or you're not. And that's that. And that's what he did.
So let's kind of go back to first principles for people who aren't necessarily aware of who they are or where they've kind of come from, or really the Australian market. Obviously here in the UK, it's very consolidated now with basically sort of national radio in most places. Why has this become a story? Where did they appear from? How have we got to here?
Yeah, so they've had 20 years on Sydney radio. They started in 2005 as the 9th ranked FM station and FM show in a market of 9 FM stations. So they were essentially the last FM show. It took us 18 months. They got to number 1 in September of 2006, had 60 survey results in a row where they were number 1, and then they left Today in 2013 for KISS, and the legend grew as they just took their audience with them. And they had some issues in and around that time, Matt, before they got to KISS, where there was just a lot of backlash about the type of content they were doing, and we had some code violations that Today were carrying on behalf of Kyle and Jack's content. And so it was in a pretty difficult situation towards the end there. And they've gone to Kiss, and he's just reinvented himself, as she has. They're winners, and Sydney is a market that loves winners. And everyone has looked at what they've done, which is the audience literally following person by person, man, woman and child, have just left 2 Day, gone straight to Kiss, one of the great turnarounds of all time. So that kind of really cemented their place in the pop culture zeitgeist in Australia. And they've just gone from strength to strength. You know, I think they were probably a 9 share on Kiss when they started in 2013. They're now 15s and 16s. To me, there's no other radio show like it in the world, really. Sydney's a very different city to Melbourne. Melbourne's much more cosmopolitan, European. It's conversations, coffees, a little more subdued, whereas Sydney is bling and flashy, and in theory the two cities don't like each other. So that's one great story. So can a Sydney show with a brash, love him or hate him host come into Melbourne and shake things up? And then, you know, radio has been telling itself this story that local really does matter, and local will win over national content. So I'm really interested, as we all are, in that question, and you guys have gone through it, Matt, as we've talked about before, whether that is a story that's still worth telling. I mean, it might be. It really, no one knows. No one knows what's going to happen. But it could be a case of Melbourne just rejecting it, saying, hey, look, it's not. He's not one of us. He doesn't understand the city. We prefer our people. And, I mean, that would be a win for the industry, I'm guessing. But I'm not so sure that that's going to happen.
I mean, Geoff, you were at heart with a breakfast show that was sort of put across lots of local areas previously that had kind of local shows with Jamie Theakston and Emma Bunton at the time. What was your take on sort of local versus national, or is it all about the power of talent?
I don't think radio in the UK has never had quite the same obsession with local that Australia does. I mean, to give you an example, when I was in Perth under Craig's leadership, you know, the shark alarm would go off on Cottesloe Beach, and you would know all the breakfast shows next morning have got some take on this. How are we going to own this story? And which I think Craig said to me more than once. And it would be an obsession. Like, this is a Perth story. We've got to nail this, and we've got to do it better than the competition. I don't think it's ever been quite that competitive and quite that local in the UK. With Jamie and Emma, I don't think it was ever a London breakfast show. It was a breakfast show that happened to be in London. You know, we would ask listeners where they were from, and if it wasn't London, we wouldn't mention. If it was, we would. And that's pretty much as local as that show got. So I don't think it had to massively change when it went to a national show. I think, actually, that's not dissimilar to Kyle and Jackie. I've never really seen that show as Sydney. They're not doing uber local Sydney content most of the time. They've already been doing a national show for the last decade. It's just, you know, it's getting to reach a new audience. I've sort of been interested, and perhaps you'll know, Craig, whether that show has had a national audience through sort of digital listening anyway. Have there been an audience in Melbourne who are sort of picking up and using it as their breakfast show, even though it's not on the FM dial?
They have. There's a national awareness of Kyle and Jackie O. They're a national brand, no question. I think the usage question is probably lower than ARN would like to tell you. I think there might be a few super fans that listen in Melbourne and other markets that use them instead of the local breakfast shows. But most of them use it. You know, it's catch up. It's the podcast where the other markets tend to kick in. But yeah, I mean, again, you know, the difference with Australia is that we have. You know, we have less stars, less national stars than you guys have, and they are, you know, upper echelon. So the other thing that's happened in the last little period of time with Kyle and Jack, so they've just signed a 10-year, $200 million contract. And that's a headline whether you're interested in radio or not. Just
trying to translate that. So that's about £100 million for 10 years.
Yes.
So it's basically sort of $5 million a year each.
Correct.
For a 10-year period.
Yes. Mind you, Christian has just signed, from what we believe, a $5 million a year contract with ARN, I think also for quite a long period of time. That was based on ARN and SCA doing the deal where ARN would take over the Triple M network, which he would have ended up being the host of their breakfast shows.
So this is Christian O'Connell, who was Absolute Radio presenter in the UK, left the UK to set up shop in Australia, in Melbourne as well. Bit of a rocky start, but he's turned into quite a big radio star over there, hasn't he?
So going back a few years when I had the Game Changers podcast, Geoff and I were mates back in Australia, obviously, and I said, look, I'm coming over for, I think it was one of your conferences, Matt, and I said, maybe we could do a version of, Game Changers UK. So Geoff, to his great credit, pulled all of these names together, people that I'd never heard of, although I knew Christian, but, I studied up on Ken Bruce and Jamie, and who else did we do? A couple of others.
Nick Ferrari, I think. Yeah.
Nick Ferrari was awesome, yeah. And so the interview with Christian, when we stopped tape at the end of it, and I'm sure you were in the room at the time, Geoff, he's going, I think I want to move out to Australia and who do I need to speak to? I think I could do something on Triple M. And in my head, I'm thinking, you're fucking crazy. What are you talking about? I mean, how's that going to work? He's one of the great presenters, but I just never thought it could work. Where an Englishman could come into a parochial market like Melbourne and do what he has done. I mean, in terms of, it's one of the great radio stories. And the country, certainly the city, have embraced Christian because he's just, he's made such an effort. Now, you guys know him better than I do, but he's just absolutely rolled his sleeves up and has worked harder than anyone else I've seen. And then obviously you combine that with the technical skill and the radio smarts and all of those things. But there were plenty of people on the sideline going, there's no way in the world this. I think the original discussion was around, sure, come to Australia, do weekends on Triple M, the rock brand, the national rock brand. Maybe something might come out of that. But Christian, to his credit, had this vision for what he thought he could do. And ARN, to their credit, Duncan Campbell, who'd spent a lot of time in the UK, and I think probably Fieldhouse was involved, and Kieran as well, they backed him in. And, to their great credit, it's one of the great hires. It really is.
I mean, does it sort of show, because sometimes we have kind of our blinkers on about what works, what's going to work, assumptions about the market. Have listeners changed? Or is sort of the power of actually just great talent and skill, does it beat everything else?
Well, I think that's the point, Matty. I think Christian is probably, ironically, the harbinger for Kyle and Jack. I think Christian has shown what could potentially happen with Kyle and Jack, which is if you're good enough, it really doesn't matter where it comes from or where you've come from. Here he is with an English accent, and yes, it maybe took 6 months for him to find his feet, but once it got going, it didn't matter. It was just, here's this amazing man who has invested in the community and the city and is doing everything he can to really embrace the town, and it was authentic and people believed it. Now, the Kyle and Jack are different. They have no interest in getting on trams or picking AFL football teams and all of the sorts of things that you would expect a breakfast show to do when they're in Melbourne. But yeah, I think, Matty, you're probably right. I think there's a question. Well, that is one of the questions. Is good enough content good enough content? Is that enough? Can it just be great content and we don't care anymore? I'm leaning towards that probably being the case, but it wouldn't surprise me if it doesn't.
Geoff, you've worked with lots of talent, big high value talent, people who are TV stars. Why do these big, huge, famous, rich people want to do radio or want to do audio?
I think there's still an immediate connection with an audience, which draws a lot of people in. I think, interestingly, in Kyle and Christian, we're talking about people who are radio talent through and through. They have not dropped in TV stars onto a high-spend breakfast show, and they are winning at what they do. And I think that is telling. I think there's a place in every schedule for a big name that will get people to try your station, or it is the shop window that you can use. But at the end of the day, great radio talent. I sort of go back to the Ken Bruce mention that you had there, because when Craig came over to do that Game Changers, I think it's fair to say Craig didn't have an awful lot of knowledge of who Ken Bruce was or why he was important in British radio. I think we've all found that out since. But there is still something for a great radio practitioner doing radio brilliantly. But I think alongside that, there is a place for A-list talent doing radio and audio. And I think, we've seen big names coming into radio, especially in the UK. That has been a big thing over the last 10 years. And Amanda Holden took over from Emma Bunton on Heart, two properly A-list. Still surprised that either of them agreed to get up at that time in the morning. But I think audio is the next space for that. I don't think there's a genuinely A-list podcast in the market at the moment. We've had a dabbling from a Michelle Obama and, Meghan and etc. But I don't think there's any truly A-list products in that space. So I think that could be the next part of this journey.
Well, you've been working on a pretty A-list project recently, working with James Corden on his Sirius XM radio show. So it's sort of podcast-like, but it's broadcast on the satellite radio service to subscribers in the US. It isn't kind of available like a normal show. Why does someone like James, who I'm sure has got a few quid in the bank and has just come off a hugely successful long run in the States, why does he want to do an audio show?
Look, success looks different to every person. And for James, and not speaking for James, but from my reading of it, yes, James has done 10 years on CBS, but a lot of those interviews are short form. It's 3 minutes, an ad break and a quick game and off you go. Fun as that is, it's not necessarily an interview. So the idea of sitting down with, Kim Kardashian and Tom Ford and Anna Wintour and David Beckham for 90 minutes and doing a properly long form deep dive is actually an interesting prospect. And I think if you can make the proposition interesting, it's not, we'll work around James's schedule, so it's not having to be on all of the time. It is 40 episodes and they're a weekly drop, but we're recording in, a relatively small number of batches. So it's not taking up all of James's time. It is creatively rewarding. The booking is great, so there's nobody on the planet who wouldn't want to sit down with the list of guests we've spoken to. And I think those are all the keys. You've really got to look at why is James doing this? What does success look like to James, and how can we create that product with him? And I should say it's James's format, it's James's idea, but everything else is just sort of working around his diary. And as anybody in the UK will know, Gavin and Stacey is coming back at Christmas, so I won't have him for a few months now, but that's okay. We've got all of those episodes in the bank, and we can really work around James to make this project work. I think that's where it's a slightly different beast to radio. The other project I did last year was Claudia Winkleman here, and very publicly she said at the end of that, her kids are getting older and weekends are important to her, and she doesn't really want to lose all of Saturday anymore to being on the radio. She wants to spend that with her children at home. And I guess that's both sides of that same problem. You've got to work around the talent more than talent works around you at this level.
Craig, historically, broadcast radio and television were in kind of huge control. We own the transmitters. We had a big checkbook. We could write checks to talent and they would sort of be ours. Nowadays, talent can go kind of direct to the consumer through podcast or YouTube, and broadcasters' sort of dominance and control of that talent has shifted. Have the companies kind of caught up with that change, do you think?
Well, I mean, it just depends on what leverage you have really in the relationship. So, talking to Kyle the other week, nothing happens on that show or around that show with them without them signing off on it. So the marketing idea, so they've got a concept at the moment in Melbourne, which is make up your own mind, which is essentially, hey, everyone has an opinion on Kyle and Jack. Why don't you listen to the show and make up your own mind? That's the idea. That was his idea. I know they went back and forth over a long period of time, 3 or 4 iterations before they landed on what he wanted. I mean, he talked on my podcast the other week about it's essentially a licensing agreement that he now has with ARN. So no different to a TV show. And he has a head of production that deals with the content directors and heads of content. So he doesn't really, from what I can gather, doesn't have a lot to do with the traditional content talent arrangement. And that is something that Kyle can do because he has a 16 share on the scoreboard. And if you don't like it, I'll go somewhere else. I think, other radio companies in other situations will try and manage situations as best they possibly can. But, Christian would be in the same situation now with ARN. He has an audience, he's got a track record, and, he now has a long deal with ARN, and it's in his favour. I've spoken to a few people about this, and, and I don't say it with any, form of happiness or glee, but I think the last great radio stars are on the radio. I don't think they're going to mint any new ones, unfortunately. Certainly in Australia. I'm sure it's different in the UK with the BBC and the younger formats there. But in Australia, all of the great radio stars are on the radio now, and now they will just age with the audience. So as a radio company, you're going to go, okay, well, if Christian is good and he's got his audience and we know he's consistently brilliant on a day-to-day basis, that job is his for as long as he wants to do it. Kyle and Jack are the same. There's a couple of other shows that have track records that aren't going anywhere. Because why would you take a chance? I think what's going to happen in Australia, and I know we've talked about this about a bit as well, Matt, the consolidation is moving really quickly now. Big national shows will happen over the next 2 to 3 years. Kyle and Jack will be the first. There will be others. National brands, all the things that you've gone through and all of the pain that has happened for individuals on the way through that are no longer working in radio or are in radio adjacent industries like podcasting, that's all coming for Australia, I think. And, some of us are accepting of that and others are struggling a bit with it, I think.
Geoff, Craig makes an interesting point there, doesn't he, about have we seen the last great radio presenter? Are they already on the air? Do you think it is different here in the UK? Do you think the scale of our stations, and I'd probably say the same for maybe for TV as well, are new talent wanting to be in broadcast environments, do you think, here?
It's a tricky ecosystem. Sure, bringing through new talent. I think we're in an over dependency of looking to, say, influencers and social media talent to fill those roles at the moment. I think possibly the tide is changing there. I think it's interesting what Craig says, especially, if that last great generation of radio talent are on air at the moment, does making those national brands create a headache 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line? Who's going to replace Kyle when he leaves? When you've now got a national breakfast show, sort of easier when you've got several metro stations to kind of bed new talent in. And, and I saw that in Perth. We were quite often a place where talent would get sent to learn their trades before coming to a bigger market. That journey existed. It's less so if you've got fewer national shows. So I think that's a slightly worrying trend for new talent.
Just a point on that, Geoff, sorry to interrupt. The one of the reasons the ARN and Kyle and Jack deal hasn't happened earlier is for that very reason, that ARN have looked at it and gone, do we really want to put all of this on black? And, if they leave in 10 years, yes, it's someone else's problem in 10 years from now, but how to unwind a show where you've built essentially an entire business model around this thing working. And I think that had always been in the back of their minds over a long period of time, because the ratings would suggest, and where the audience is moving would suggest, that you would move to that model maybe 2 or 3 years earlier. But I think that's always been their challenge, which is, okay, are we getting married here? Is this permanent? What does this look like? Because it's all in Kyle and Jackie's favour now. They've got a 10-year deal and they'll probably sign another 5-year deal after that. And so, there is no replacement strategy. There's no plan B. But that's the world we're living in now, right? It's just that's we all have to get comfortable with that.
We sort of went through that with Hamish and Andy, and the end of that show being incredibly disruptive, to a lot of networks where
so painful.
They were the kings of SCA at that period, and certainly while I was there, and longer while you were there. So it can be really disruptive to an entire network to, as you say, put everything on black.
And Geoff, you work with a lot of bigger talent. Have broadcasters got to almost create joint ventures with them? Because that's sort of what ARN have done with Kyle and Jack. I mean, here in the UK, to entice those big talent into the globals or the Bauers of the world, have we got to come up with new ways of working with them? Yeah,
terms of trade on those are so important. And I know, and you will know, Audio UK have just done a massive piece of work with the BBC and their terms of trade. And if you are looking to land talent, those IP conversations, those, rights reversion clauses are are everything. Nobody's doing this for a fee anymore. There is a bigger picture to everything. So I think that is absolutely crucial and at the heart of every talent conversation from now on. I think of everything I've heard around Kyle and Jackie, that licensing comment of the show existing in its own right and being licensed to a radio station to be their breakfast show is, I think, the most telling future trend in this entire story. I can absolutely see talent owning the show, and perhaps percentages of commercial income from that show in the future. We're not a million miles from that.
Do you think we're going to see more of that, Craig? Do you think it's more of a challenge even in a smaller market like Australia too?
Yeah, I agree. And it's interesting, you know, what Kyle and Jackie have done is they've insulated themselves from people like me, to be honest. The point that I really want to make for you guys and for your listeners is that when I think about Kyle and Jack and I listen to how the show has evolved, so you know, we were talking before about long form versus short form. So the two things that stood out for me, obviously, was the line that has moved in terms of how edgy the show is and the language and those sorts of things. So that was point one. The other thing that stood out for me was the 25-minute talk breaks that they do with no music. So song count out the door. You know, as Kyle has said, I would rather talk for 25 minutes because our audience want to hear us speak, and we'll play an ad and we'll come back and talk some more, you know, and we might take a breather and play Tate McRae for 2.5 minutes. But, you know, if we want to talk for another 25 minutes, if the content is good, that's what we're going to do. And when I heard him talk about that and when I heard the show and you know, he's protected himself from people like me, because people like me would say, 5-minute talk breaks, hit the news on time, song count, you know, all of the things that we think are important for radio. He has proven people like me to be wrong at every single term. And I think the lesson for us as programmers and talent development people is that, you know, when you get someone that's really unique like Kyle and Christian, but certainly Kyle and Jackie, all bets are off. Once they've found the formula, it has to be theirs, and you've just got to get out of their way. And that's one of the reasons. It's not a licensing agreement, but that's how he sees it. It's like, stay away from me. I know what I'm doing. I'll bring you in when I need you. But he's not getting air checked by people like me anymore because he knows what he's doing. And sometimes that's a hard thing for us to get our heads around, because you want to feel like, okay, well, I need to be involved. I need to be supportive in some way. But the most supportive thing that you can do, again, if it was up to me, the show would have 5 songs an hour and 5-minute talk breaks. And it would be not even close to the show that it is today. So, you know, it's such a lesson for us and certainly for me individually. It's like, wow, you know, got to learn from that. You know, when you get someone really talented, you've got to get out of their way. It doesn't happen often. I mean, I may have experienced this 3 times in my career. Hamish and Andy would be the other obvious one, and certainly Kyle and Jackie. There might be 1 or 2 others, but it does take a bit to just let Kyle be Kyle.
For me, listening to that show, Craig, there's still a lot of traditional commercial radio furniture around what is quite a revolutionary show. And for me, actually, often it's jarring when they'll go and play a pop quiz or a guess the noise, which are quite old school formats in what is quite a revolutionary show. Do you think there's more to come from them of pushing that furniture away and just doing their own thing?
Yeah, and maybe this is unique to Kyle, and I would suggest Christian is similar. Like, Kyle is an old school radio person, so, you know, everyone is talking about that show right now, and he could have talked to anyone in the media, TV, you know, magazines, whatever, and he came to us, our Melbourne Radio Wars podcast. He knows it's filled with radio people. He just wants to talk to people like us. So he's a one-off in that respect. So he's got the radio mind. And then he's got frankly, the balls to go, you know what, I'm just going to do it my way. And then he's got this incredible partnership with Jackie, this chemistry and dynamic where they can talk for 20 minutes and it's still interesting at the 19-minute mark. But we wouldn't have let them find that out for themselves if we'd gotten in their way.
Geoff, you've produced kind of Chris Evans and James Corden, who are kind of producers themselves. are you able to produce a producer? Don't they know all the tricks already? What you're trying to make them do?
I did think when I was listening to Kyle and Jackie a couple of days ago, and I thought, I'm not sure how I'd produce this. I'm not sure if I'd be allowed to produce this. There is an alternate universe. I don't know if Craig remembers this, but when I first went to Australia, Craig asked me if I'd come to Sydney and have a conversation about working on Kyle and Jackie show at the time, and me and my family decided not to put our visas in Kyle's hands, which may or may not have turned out to have been a good decision in the long term.
Good call,
How
mate.
do you... Maybe. How do you produce talent like that? I think a lot of time, and this is true of talent who are good producers, and it's true of any creative. I'd put James in that same category, actually. James is a really shrewd operator. I think a lot of time it's about getting out of their way and letting them operate. And sure, you can, give advice and give feedback, but I think any producer who thinks they know everything is probably going through that hubristic phase that we all go through. Christian is a great example of someone who would come in with 50 ideas a day and actually just needed a little help picking them, was probably his thing. When I left Chris's show, I bought Chris a gift for me leaving. I was like, actually, I've learned so much from you as to how to produce a show than probably any of the other producers that I've ever worked with. But I think the key thing is working collaboratively with them and getting out of their way, right? They're good for a reason. They're where they are for a reason. And if you can protect them, and this is a personal thing, I've never been that producer on air, because I think part of my job with that scale of talent is to be able to defend them when it all goes wrong, and I can't be part of that. So I will very much sit back and stop everybody else from coming into this studio. I was going to mention an example then, but it's probably best not to. But your job quite often as the producer of a show can be to keep management out of the studio and to let your talent shine. And quite often you're that guardsman at the door. But it is a joy to work with talent who have that ability to make radio or bring great ideas, and quite often you're facilitating that.
Yeah, I've always found that it's so much harder to program a show with a light touch. It's really easy to go into a show that is new, that is young, where you've got to transfer some information over a period of time, and you can go back to basics and do all those sorts of things. But with high-end talent, programming with a light touch or supporting them with a light touch, it's so much more nuanced because what can I say in this moment to help them feel self-assured and comfortable with what they're doing. The best piece of feedback I ever had around this and working with high-end talent was just to talk to them about reactions, so personal reactions. So if you've heard a show and you've reacted to something either funny, emotionally, whatever it might be, that will be enough for them just to go, that bit you did at 8 o'clock, that was really funny, or that really moved me. I haven't heard you talk about that like that before, and no more than that. That's enough. It doesn't. You could have gotten out earlier, or why was it 5 minutes and not 3? None of that. Just the reaction. When I heard you do that, it made me stop and think about my own family. Or when I heard that piece, I'd never thought of it like that before, and I really appreciated that in the moment. That's enough. Because the idea is that, sometimes we get lost in the fact that we think that a light touch means no feedback at all. I can guarantee you, and I think I've said this to Geoff before as well. So, I did 50 A graders with the Game Changers podcast, like A grade, Christian O'Connell, that level of presenter. And I can tell you the same conversation I had at the end of every interview when the mics went off. They would look at me on the other side of the desk and go, "Was that okay, Craig?" And I'm going, "What are you fucking talking about? You're a superstar. Of course it was okay." So don't think for a second that these people don't, it's bravado if you see that confidence and self-assurance, but they just want to know did we have a connection here? Did that work? Of course it worked. And so that kind of feedback with high-end talent, it's a much harder thing to do because, Geoff is right. You've got to find a way to get out of their way, but you also want to show that you're listening and you're engaged in what they're doing, and you want to show appreciation and recognition for something that's worked. So I think that's certainly something I try and do wherever I can.
I think listening is the key word. Your job is to listen more than talk at that level.
Well, Craig and Geoff, it's been great to listen to you talk at your levels for the last hour. Thanks for joining us. Where can people keep up with what you're doing, Geoff?
Well, if you're in the States, I highly recommend downloading the SiriusXM app and listening to James's show. And for anyone else, biscuitgym.com.
Lovely. And Craig, how can people keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, we're about, what are we now, 8 episodes into Melbourne Radio Wars, which is more than just about Melbourne. There's a lot of strategy and marketing and talent discussions that we're having. So we'll run that until we get a result. I reckon maybe late July, August, we get a survey result with Kyle and Jack that is a full survey result. So we'll see what that looks like. So, yeah, if you get a chance to have a listen, that would be awesome. And always good to talk with you, Maddie, and great to see you again, Geoff. Geoff was one of our great producers and a great loss when he decided to go home. But I've always had a great connection with Geoff, and it's good to see your face down the line, mate.
And you.
Great to see you both.